So as Susan said, I'm a prehistorian, and my interest is, can everybody hear me? I don't want to be using a mic. I tend to move around a bit. But I have an interest in kind of notions of how the past can be reappropriated, or places can be reused by different groups and reinterpreted. So the same place can have different meanings for different people. So like this image here is a pen and ink by a modern Irish artist called Louis Le Brocq, who passed away a few years ago. And it's from a book published in the late 60s by Thomas Kinsella. And it's a kind of a very good translation of an epic story called The Táin, which is the battle raid of Cooley. So the Ulstermen in Northern Ireland in the Arden Age had a cow or a bull, and the Connacht people under a woman called Queen Maeve didn't have this bull that could match the Ulstermen's bull. So Queen Maeve decided she needed, and she's a sovereignty goddess. She's not actually a real queen. And she wants to acquire a bull so that she can be because the sovereignty goddess needs to be in balance. And this big epic battle, this is our kind of, the Irish kind of legendary epic story. So as school children in Ireland, we all know the story of the Táin. So Maeve amasses her armies and attacks Ulster. So she goes from a place in Roscommon called Rathcroghan, which is a royal site. I'll be mentioning it shortly. She then goes to Tara, where she's also a sovereignty goddess. All the men of Ireland then attack Ulster, but the Ulstermen are cursed because their king had annoyed another goddess, and if they were attacked, all the men of Ulster went into childbirth. So they were rolling around in agony while all this battle is going on, and only one hero is unaffected by this curse. So he doesn't feel as if he's going into childbirth pangs. And he's a guy called Cú Chulainn. And Cú Chulainn, at the end of the battle, he's mortally wounded. He's a demigod. He's a half man, half god. His father was a guy called Lugh Lá Bhoda, or Lugh Samuel Donach. He's a Celtic sun god. But Cú Chulainn is fatally injured, and he denied another goddess called the Morrigan. And the Morrigan is a shapeshifter. So the Morrigan she changes into an eel in the story. And when Cú Chulainn is fighting in the ford as an eel, she wraps around his ankles, so he's finding it difficult to fight. And she turns into a red ear heifer, but she also turns into a raven. So he defends Ulster single-handedly against the armies of Ireland. But he's fatally wounded, but he ties himself to a standing stone and keeps fighting until he eventually fades. But his enemies are afraid to come up close to him until the Morrigan turns into a raven and lands on his shoulder, and then they know he's dead. So this story about this kind of heroic figure fighting to the death was appropriated by Eamon de Valera, who becomes the Taoiseach of Ireland in the 1930s after the foundation of the Free State. So during 1916, Eamon de Valera was one of the rebel army with Patrick Pearson and a number of others. And in 1916, the Irish General Post Office was destroyed during the Irish Rebellion. It was rebuilt, and it took at the 20th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, Eamon de Valera reopened the GPO and had commissioned a statue of Cú Chulainn to commemorate the battle and the fallen dead. And it's kind of an interesting one because it was made by a guy called Oliver Shepherd, who was a Celtic revivalist. And it was actually made in 1914, but he didn't sell it. Nobody wanted to buy it until De Valera came along in 1936 and bought it off Oliver Shepherd. And it's now in the window here in the GPO. It also formed a medal for Irish rebels. It's a stamp. In the 1960s, it was a coin minted. So it's a regular feature And it's kind of almost, as Oliver Shepherd had trained in London and Paris and was a big fan of Rodin. It's a very kind of impressionist kind of element, but it's like the dying Christ almost. So there's a lot of kind of interesting images that it's used for. But it was reappropriated then, this story about this Celtic hero of Cú Chulainn, and it was used by like this statue here is at a memorial, where again you have the raven on the Cú Chulainn shoulder. This is a provisional IRA memorial in Andersontown in Belfast. And again you have that statue, same statue, copied on Republican murals in Belfast. You see it again. But what's really interesting is the same statue is being used by loyalists, because as a defender of Ulster, he was reappropriated. So in the same city in Belfast, one nationalist community are using the symbol of Cú Chulainn that statue which represents the 1916 Rising, but at the same time he's being appropriated by the loyalists to represent the defender of Ulster against the invading Irish from this kind of Celtic heroic past. So Ireland's history is complicated, and we have these two very different traditions. Often as not, the loyalist tradition is seen as something quite austere. It's linked to kind of Masonic lodges, Presbyterian Protestantism, and then while Catholics are all drinking Guinness on the 17th of March and marching down the street having fun. So there's this very contested kind of notions of identity still present, unfortunately. It's a lot better in the last 20 years. So since the Good Friday Agreement, Ireland is a completely changed place, and I'm sure Dr. Doyle would agree, and his students. But what you have is kind of, you've kind of got these very interesting kind of notions. So in Northern Ireland, identities can be formed through ideas about the past. So this book here, Eston Evans, who's a historical geographer and an archaeologist, he wrote a number of different publications about the North and about Ireland and folk life. But he was actually from Wales originally, and the border countries between Wales and England, kind of very close on the River Severn. But he was working in Northern Ireland and Queens. And in his book, he identifies Northern Ireland as being a distinct place, a place apart. And it isn't really. But you kind of get this impression as a Protestant borderland kind of concept of this kind of differing Northern Ireland to Southern Ireland. So in kind of even an academic text. But then Ian Admonson published this interesting book called The Cruachan. And the Cruachan are a Bronze Age, in inverted commas, according to Admonson, a Bronze Age dynastic group who are forced out of Northern Ireland, according to his thesis and his research. They're forced out of Northern Ireland by incoming Celts, and they're pushed into Western Scotland. And it's only when plantation period in the 17th century starts happening, as Ulster Scots Presbyterians, they return to their promised land where they originated from. Very strong parallels with notions of the Israeli notion of a promised land. And it's kind of interesting when you go to places like Belfast and in the north, you're seeing juxtaposed Unionist, Loyalist, United Kingdom flags, Ulster flags with the Star of David and the Israeli flag. I just stuck this one here. You have an Israeli flag, a Nazi flag, a Confederate flag, and a Union Jack. So the flags are a big contentious thing in Northern Ireland. You get kind of maybe tricolours in nationalist areas, not too much, but when you go to Unionist areas, footpaths are painted red, white and blue, and it's very in your face. But it's kind of interesting, you know, in Republican areas, up until recently even, you'd find Palestinian flags flying, along with Irish tricolours. And it's this idea that's through the notion of these symbols of flags of creating identity. A lot of people, Ian Admonson, there's nothing archaeologically or historically factual about anything he's written. So You can visit his website, but as an archaeologist and a historian, albeit with my biasness of being brought up a Catholic Republican by my father, I'm clever enough to understand that everything he wrote is a whole load of rubbish. But I'm sure if you ever invite him over as a Strickland scholar, he might say something different to me. But I would examine what he has to say, and you'll find that it's pretty false. But what I'd like to talk to you tonight is about one particular place, which is Tara. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, but just to try to explain to you that there's a number of these, what we call royal sites. They're named as royal sites by Angus on Culdee is his name, written in the Martyrology of Angus in the 9th century. So we're very lucky in Ireland. We have these incredible early medieval and late medieval texts that have survived through the ages, written on vellum and kept in different Gaelic lordships' libraries through time. So we have this fantastic collection of early sources. Now, a lot of them are historiographers, like they're nonsense, they're propaganda, but there's lots of kind of really useful things for us to glean from as archaeologists. But there's a number of sites, Tara in County Meath, Knockgallen in County Kildare, Navanforth in Armagh, Rathcroghan in County Roscommon, which all have very similar archaeological sites. The morphology of the monuments are quite similar, and a lot of the kind of medieval texts that talk about them have similar kind of ideas of inauguration, of kingship, etc. There's a few other sites like Cashel in County Tipperary and Ishnock in Westmeath that have kind of similar arrangements of monuments and kind of hints of links with notions of kingly inauguration that are pre-Christian in origin. And it's this notion about sacral kingship, that the idea that these aren't kings like kings of England or kings of France, like Louis or any of these. These are petty kings that are commanding chief. They're almost like chieftains, probably better than kings. So they're small dynastic groups that are relatively fractured, but there seems to be a collection of about 5 of them that seem to control fairly large territories. And it's linking in the notion of kingship with a goddess of sovereignty. So Queen Maeve often features. Maeve is a really interesting goddess. The name Maeve means she who intoxicates. So she's often associated with mead. So the alcoholic drink mead, the medieval Irish drink, is actually the root word is the same name. It's an Indo-European word about drinking. So drinking is part of this inauguration of a king. It's kind of interesting as well. This is an illustration from a book called Topographica Hiberniae by Gerald Cobrensis, who was a chronicler for an Anglo-Norman king, Edward II. And he describes an inauguration of an O'Donnell chieftain, where the O'Donnell chieftain has sex with a horse, and then a white mare, and then they butcher the mare, and the king, after he's inaugurated, gets into a pot, and his vassals then eat the horse meat out of the vat. So this is they're killing the horse, they cook it, and then the king is naked, sitting in a big vat, eating the horse meat, and it's kind of a bit mad, isn't it? But this is Anglo-Norman propaganda. But a lot of our Irish kingship is about horses are often associated with goddesses as well. So Mocha, who's the goddess in Armagh, is a horse goddess, same as Mapona in Wales and England. But these places are often associated with religious power associated with the king being symbolically married to the earth, which will allow fertility and lots of positive things. And they'd often use earlier monuments. So no matter if it's the 7th century, 8th century, 12th century, whatever it might be, Gaelic lords are getting inaugurated often on much older sites. So they're reappropriating Bronze Age burial mounds, Neolithic tombs, this type of thing. And these monuments are aggrandized or mixed up. So we have a number of royal sites, And this is kind of Ireland in a very simplified way around the beginning of 700, or beginning of the 8th century. So you've kind of the Crooknew. So there's these guys that Ian Edmondson talks about that were kicked out by the Celts. They're actually still here. They weren't kicked out at all. They're still in the up around County Antrim. You have the Uliad, who form a kingship with Dalriada in Scotland. You have the Northern O'Neill, and that's the O'Neills, the O'Donnells. It's a very complicated dynastic group. The Southern O'Neill, the Lagan or the Leinstermen, the Moo or Munstermen, and the Connacht, which is Ireland was divided up originally into 5 provinces: Ulster, Munster, Leinster, Connacht, and Meath. Today we only have 4. So the central powerhouse of Meath isn't a province anymore, but that's another story. But Tara is one of these most important of the royal sites. So this is an illustration of Tara done by George Petrie, who was a very famous Irish antiquarian and headed up the Ordnance Survey that started mapping Ireland at the beginning of the 19th century at a scale of 6 inches to 1 mile. And one of his students was William Wakeman. Another student or component was John O'Donovan. So some very important 19th century antiquarians that were working really originally with the Ordnance Survey at this massive, very detailed scaled 6 inches to 1 mile map of Ireland. And a lot of the kind of information we have about Tara is related to a thing called the Din Shenkis, which is a 10th century collection of place lore. So the Irish were mad into place names. So it was part of their entertainment. How did a place get its name? And then there's a big story about, well, it's because this guy got stabbed, this person, and his wife was really upset, so she cried so much that her tears filled the valley and made a lake. And that's why the lake has got this name. So that type of thing. So the Din Shenkis, this was a popular kind of way. But it was, so based on the Din Shenkis collection of stories, we have these place names for different monuments on the hill of Tara that have stuck. So Chochmid Curta is the banqueting hall, Rathgrania is Grania's fort, the Clun Fert is the sloping trenches, Rat Choch Cormac is Cormac's house, the Farad meaning a platform, Doomagall is the mound of the hostages. So these place names are all associated with a 10th century collection of stories. So this is a LiDAR image of what the hill of Tara looks like with the vegetation stripped away with a bit of nice, we as archaeologists like to use LiDAR imaging because you can kind of see things better. Like you can see all these little barrows that you can't see on the normal aerial photograph. So with LiDAR you can get lots of really good detail. So between the mixture of LiDAR imaging, field survey, geophysical surveying, there's 150 monuments on the hill of Tara. Most of them are Bronze Age burial sites. I'm going to flick through some of them. But to compare Tara with some of the other royal sites, there's certain similarities. So Knockallna, you can't see the geophysics, but it's these massive, this is about 210 metre diameter enclosure, but it's got a bank on the outside and a ditch on the inside. That's an inversion of normal defensive features. So this is actually a ritual site because it's enclosing the space to keep whatever powers in here, whatever otherworldly powers that inhabit the interior of this space, it keeps them from getting out. So it's the inversion of what you'd normally find on a defensive structure because the ditch is on the inside and the bank is on the outside. So that's a kind of a feature of a lot of these royal sites, massive enclosures. And internally you get a whole load of different other archaeological sites. So this was excavated and found figure of 8 structures that would be typical of royal sites. So Dunalna is one of them. Navan Fort in County Armagh would be another, where you're getting prehistoric barrows. This is what's called the 40-metre structure. It's really complicated. There's a figure of 8 structure under this. That's Bronze Age, where they found a Barbary ape that comes from Morocco. They found a skeleton of a Barbary ape. So the guy there that was living there about 1000 BC had a pet ape from Morocco, kind of, that's, hey, look at me, I got a pay. Hey. But then they bury that in they put a 40-metre structure with about 300 post holes in it. So timber structure surrounded by a bank. And then they bury the timber structure in a big pile of stones. And then they set the timber structure on fire. And then they bring soil from a whole load of places, like the Mississippi Mounds. They bring soil from all around the territory and then bury it in this big thing. About 150 BC. But this big internally ditched enclosure again is one of these features of. And then another one of the royal sites at Rathcroghan has this massive mound with a very interesting thing. It's about, this is geophysical survey again. It's about maybe 80 centimetres below the grass. Nobody's dug it yet. It's on a load of people's to-do list. But interestingly then, when they carried out geophysics, that's the mound there with the thing on the top, but there's a 300-metre diameter enclosure. You can see funnel entrances, barrows. So all of these sites have really complicated, kind of all the way through time, there's stuff going on. But up in Tara, there's like I said, there's about 150 monuments, predominantly Bronze Age barrows. These ring enclosures with rings and little mounds and bumps, different forms of barrows. One of the oldest sites, I'll just show you, it's this one here. What's interesting is this linear arrangement. We call these cursus monuments, and it looks like a ceremonial routeway that's going up to this. So what you're looking at here is a palimpsest. You know, there's layer upon layer upon layer of time of loads of different monuments using this space. Well, one of the earliest monuments is this little passage tomb called the Mound of the Hostages. And again, this is true legend and folklore that the king would take hostages from sub-vassals so that the petty kings wouldn't, if you annoy me, I'll kill your son. So in legends, this is where the hostages were stored, which is not true at all. But it's part of the kind of narrative about Tara. So this was excavated in the 50s. It has megalithic art on one of the stones. But underneath it, there's an earlier sequence of events. There's a palisade enclosure and a number of pits and burning areas. But then the passage tomb itself then has a whole series of burials within the chamber, but there's also perimeter burials of stone-lined pits with cremations or inhumations in them. This has had nearly 300 burials in it, a mixture of Neolithic, so that's the dates are about 3,100 to 2,800 BC, and then it's commingled with early Bronze Age burials, which are about 2,500 BC. So you can see it's predominantly cremations, but there's inhumations as well, but they're mixed together, so you're getting skulls. That's a skull cap there. Bits of inhumation. It's really an amazing site. But it's reused again. So going back to this image, so this is the cover of the passage tomb, but then they came along in the Bronze Age and added a big pile of earth and turned it into a Bronze Age cemetery. And these are all the Bronze Age burials, these orange colours that were implanted in the top. So these burials were often accompanied by, were interred in pots, so they were all cremations. So the cremations are put inside these decorative early Bronze Age vessels, urns, vases and bowls. One of them stands out, burial number 30. It's kind of out on its own. And you can see cremation. Yeah, they're all cremated, and they all have vases, bowls, collared urns. He doesn't. He's totally different, and his grave goods are totally different. And he's buried under a big rock. This is him here. Toponomically, he's a bit wrecked, because he's been crushed by soil and all kinds of things. But really interesting, he stands out completely to all the other burials. He's a little bit later. He's kind of middle Bronze Age, and he was identified as a robust, middle-aged man. He's called Tara Boy, but in the Bronze Age, 15 years old. Life expectancy is about 30, so he's middle-aged. And 14 or 15, he probably had 3 or 4 children, or potentially could have. So we kind of forget about this when we talk about notions of age, that, you know, you can only, in America, you can drink when you're 21. This guy could have had 3 or 4 kids and could be drinking every day. You know, we don't know. But what's extraordinary were his grave goods. And what's really interesting about all the grave goods with him are they're gendered, they're female. So the type of grave goods this guy was buried with, all of them are female. But he's 100% male. So he could be a kind of a two-spirit entity, or so it's something that it's really interesting. He's a really interesting guy. He was buried with faience, which is glass-blown beads. The geochemistry on these showed that they were made locally. But the jet, the black shiny bead, that's from Whitby in Yorkshire in northeastern England. The amber's from the Baltic. The bronzes, these bronze tubular beads were manufactured in Ireland, but with Cornish tin. So this guy is a composite of lots of connections. And a lot of the style of this is all very closely related to what's happening in southern Britain in a place called Wessex around Stonehenge. So he's a really interesting guy. Based on the excavations that meant that the hostage, there was a palisaded enclosure. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Then the Pastor's tomb, just looking at morphologically what was happening on Tara, the Pastor's tomb was built. Then we think the cursus, that avenue, was then constructed. Then Rathmave, an embanked enclosure, embanked barrows were constructed. Then Middle Bronze Age barrows were added, more ring barrows, and the construction of Rathnaree around the Arden Age, Rathnasenid and Rathlera by the late Arden Age, and then in the early medieval period, there's new constructions. So there's this landscape is evolving through time with newer and newer monuments, and they're reusing older sites all the time. So this one here, this is based, it's called the banqueting hall because according to an early medieval text, the gaps were where the king would enter through one door, poets would enter through another door, slaves would enter through the back part, musicians would go through another door. So each kind of gap, according to the Dinchenkus, was depending on your status, was where you'd enter into a banqueting hall. It's not a banqueting hall. It's a ceremonial avenue. And what's really interesting is we think these were actually cut out. So the monument hasn't been excavated, but the monument itself is Neolithic, but the gaps in the banks are actually lining up on other monuments. So as you process and look through the gap, you're seeing, kind of looking back to the past and ideas of ancestry and belonging. So it's a really interesting site. The Clwyd Ferta are a series of kind of slightly disturbed barrows. You can see them much clearer on the LiDAR image than here, but there's loads of little barrows with bigger barrows. These are fancy barrows. So these are kind of holding Bronze Age burials, most likely early to Middle Bronze Age. Again, these haven't been excavated. But they're on a slope on a hill, and the reason for this is because a mythical king called Louis Macon, a woman had, somebody's sheep had gone into a woman's, the queen's woad field. So woad is used for dyeing. And these sheep had entered the woad field and eaten all the woad, and the queen was annoyed, and so the fine was to kill all the sheep. The king made this judgment. But another king-like guy called Cormac MacArt came along and went, no, it's a much better judgment is that the woman should be, or the queen should be compensated in the wool for this loss. And everybody agreed that was a much more wiser judgment. And because Louis Macon's false judgment was so bad, all the things fell off the side of the hill. And so that's why they're called the sloping trenches, because his enclosure collapsed because of his false judgment. So there's other sites, again, fancy barrows, and they're named after goddesses. So Grania is a really interesting character that afterwards I can tell you about Grania, because I'm a fan of Grania. Her and a guy called Dermot ran around Ireland being chased by a guy called Fionn McCool. It's called The Pursuit of Dermot and Grania. She was the daughter of Cormac MacArt, and she dies in Sligo, so I have a connection with Grania. Rathnaree is this, so they're predominantly all Bronze Age sites. Rathnaree, though, this massive enclosure, it's a 3 metre wide ditch, it's 2 metres deep, rock cut into shale bedrock. So this is hardcore digging. It's 220 metres by 140 metres. It's a serious undertaking. At the entrance, which is kind of a bit, this section here was excavated in the 80s, and they found a child burial, Arden Age, about 150 BC, and a dog. We were talking about dogs earlier. So the dog and this child burial might have been sacrificial, this bounded space entering this ritual enclosure, a ceremonial enclosure. These monuments then are later. So this is the Passus tomb. Rath of the Synods, it's called Rath of the Synods because in the annals it says that there was a religious synod held here in the 9th century. But it hasn't got anything to do with religious meetings. It's a multi-phase monument. There's about 7, this was excavated again in the 50s. There's about 7 different events. There's barrows in this. There's a really extraordinary rectangular structure right in the middle that had Roman material in it. So a lot of people say the Romans never got to Ireland, but they definitely did, probably in small numbers. But there was a Roman Arden padlock and key, Roman glass, Samian ware, which is fancy drinking vessel pottery. So this is probably a late Arden Age, but there's Bronze Age barrows in it. And you can see that this is the 1950s excavation trenches, but there's other trenches cut in, and I'll get to them shortly, because that's something to do with Indiana Jones indirectly. These sites here are really interesting because you can see there's kind of bulbous things in the bank. They're actually barrows. So they're Bronze Age burial mounds, but and this mound here is also a barrow, a fancy barrow, but it's got a double bank and ditch that was put there in the 8th century. And this thing again then is 8th century. So these are conjoined royal residents, we think. And you can see there's a square-shaped structure in the middle of this that is presumably a house. So this is called a forad, which means a platform. So this could be something to do with royal inauguration. So, and then this thing here was discovered in 1999. Nobody knew it was there. This huge, massive enclosure, 170 meters in diameter. And you can see there's massive 2 meter diameter post holes all around it. So there's 300 oak trees that were chopped down to make this thing. So it must have looked incredible. So what I'm trying to convey is Tara is not just, it's dynamic, it's changing all the way from 4000 BC coming up into the 8th century. Also, there's very few finds from Tara, apart from those couple of excavations. And this was a stray find by a child actually digging potatoes and found a gold torque. Woohoo! 2 gold torques. So these are the gold, so you can see the clasp. This is solid gold, Middle Bronze Age, about 1200 BC. Famously, there's this thing called the Tara brooch. Have you heard of the Tara brooch? Have people ever heard of this? Yeah, so Tara brooch is, everybody in Ireland's heard of the Tara brooch. If you're into Irish dancing, you'll see the girls dancing and they'll have these type of pannier brooches on their or woven onto it. So these are pseudo pannier types. They're kind of a bit unusual. And they're part of a pair. So we're missing the other part of it. This chain would have linked onto another, so you'd have two of these brooches holding a cloak together, we think. And it's made out of gold and silver with filigree gold work. This is like, it's 7th, 8th century. This is phenomenal. There's nothing in Europe to match this in terms of craftsmanship. It's phenomenal. So you've got amber coming again from the Baltic, enameling The thing is extraordinary. But it's not from Tara. It's from a place called Bettystown. So it should be actually called the Bettystown brooch, but that doesn't sound as sexy as a Tara brooch. It was actually found by two boys in 1850, and their mother brought it to a watchmaker who bought it off her for 18 pence. What a swine. And then he made a bit of a profit by selling it to a watchmaker in Dublin for £12. This watchmaker then was a guy called George Waterhouse. This is still in Dublin. This jeweller's is still there, Waterhouse Jeweller on Dame Street. And he was already producing Celtic revival stuff. So he was already making penannular brooches by the shed load. But this was like exceptional. And he called it the Tara brooch because it would sell better, because Tara in people's minds was seen as a place of the high kings, etc., etc. And he actually brought it to the London exhibition and to the exhibition in Paris. And like I say here, Queen Victoria went, so I'll have a couple of them. They're cool. So she bought two of his replicas, these things here. And then they were called, because Queen Victoria owned two of them, it got the name the Royal Tara brooch, because she had them. So to go back to kind of this notion of kingship, that Tara has, you know, if again as a schoolboy in Ireland, or if you ask any Irish person, Tara is the seat of the High King. And that's not true. So this is this myth again about the place. The idea of the fear flahaman, it means the justice of a ruler. So it's very important if the king doesn't impart wise judgment, it was seen as problematic. And this is a feature in all Irish mythology. If the king isn't just, it causes disharmony, it causes chaos. So everything about a lot of these early texts are about a kind of a balance. So the king is supposed, or a leader. So I'm using the word king very loosely. It's not like our image of kings with, you know, on the coronation throne with a big crown. Irish kings would be territorial rulers. But Tara, though, had, when you read all the early medieval texts, does have this very strong importance. It does seem to have a greater weight to it than any other of the kings in Cashel or Ishnok or Rathcroghan, etc. Tara does resonate. And all the medieval texts are talk about Tara's importance. Is Tara here? Where's Tara? Let's just say I was talking to Tara earlier, just saying how wonderful she is. And what you find in Ireland, we have these wealth of annals. And in the annals you see these kind of struggles between different dynastic groups. So you're seeing battles between the Leinstermen and the Ulstermen. You're seeing battles between men from Connacht and from the Southern Neil. You see the Northern Neil fighting the Southern Neil, all for control of Tara. And it's generally speaking, by the 7th century, coming into the 8th century, you're seeing the Southern Neil starting to dominate as kings of Tara. I just threw this in because I thought it was kind of funny. This guy, he got stung in the eye by a bee, so he lost his kingship. Any king that has a blemish can't be a king. So if you get your arm chopped off in a battle, you can't be a king anymore. There is a mythical king called Nuda, and he got his arm chopped off in a battle, but a god of medicine, the son of the god of medicine called Meoch came, and Nuda had a silver arm, but he still couldn't be king because he had a silver arm. You needed a real arm. But this guy Meoch then dug up his withered, kind of decomposing arm that he lost in the battle and stuck it back on. But the god of medicine, Dinkek, was kind of jealous that his son could do this, so he killed his son. And anyway, you get these kind of interest. And like there's this amazing collection of stories or laws, the Irish 7th century law texts. I don't know if any of you have come across them. They're absolutely amazing. They're called the Brehons, and they were the kind of early medieval lawyers. And anything where there was a dispute, they made a law about it. And they'd consult with the king. So there's a brilliant law about if your neighbour's dog trespasses on your land and does a poo, that you've got to compensate your neighbour in the weight of butter that the poo is. So you've got to weigh the dog poo, and your neighbour then has to compensate you with the same weight in butter. I think that's kind of sensible. And the same actually to encourage beekeeping, you know, to spread beekeeping. I keep bees, but to spread beekeeping in the 7th century, they had a law about trespassing bees. Like you can't really stop a bee trespassing, but so if bees are go trespassing on someone's land for clover or for you've got to then when the hive splits, you've got to give your neighbour the new hive, and that was encouraging a way to encourage everybody to keep bees. Very sensible stuff. So this is part of the law tract on beekeeping. Anyway, I'm diverting as I tend to do, but you're seeing this again. This guy, Mael Strickland, who dies in he's also an O'Neill dynasty. So it's these dynastic rulers, and he's starting to call himself a king of Ireland, but he's actually what? Oh my God, I've millions of slides to get through. But you'd never have a high kingship. And so you're seeing this development of through propaganda, through Irish praise poetry about kings, and creating new myths and new identities, that you're seeing notions of high kingship. But in reality, they never really controlled the entire Ireland. So you have this kind of, again, so Tara evolves into something that it isn't. But it's kind of, again, it creates this identity or this notion or this symbolic political core. So it becomes this, particularly after the Anglo-Norman invasion. You see people like the O'Neills and the O'Donnells who rebel against Henry VIII and later against Elizabeth, launching campaigns there. You're seeing against Cromwell's 1641 rebellion. In 1798, Tara is a site of a battle. During the battle, several hundred men die, Irish rebels against the English forces, mainly yeomanry, and they fall on the hill of Tara. And they're buried up here. This is a memorial to them. But they moved this stone, the Lee of Fall, which is called the Stone of Destiny. It's an inauguration stone that used to be in front of the passage tomb, but was moved in 1798, where there's now a mass grave. Unfortunately, back in 2004, it was blamed on a group of loyalists that poured black gloss paint over it, because again, this symbolises notions of Celtic identity or Irish identity. Tara also was the seat of the repeal, one of Daniel O'Connell's unbelievable monster meetings, but he chooses his monster meetings in strategic places that resonate in Irish past. So he has a monster meeting at Clontarf, where the Irish defeat the Vikings. He has a monster meeting at Tara, which is the seat of the High Kingship. So Tara evokes all of these particular meanings. So this is Indiana Jones. What an extraordinary thing is this group, the British Israelites, come in 1895. The British Israelites are a group of, they're Protestant Christians. These are the ultimate white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They believed that they were descendants of the tribes of Israel that had eventually ended up as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and that them, not the Jews, were the chosen one, and that the empire was part of their inheritance as the chosen ones from the Old Testament. But they believe Tara, there's different translations of Tara, so Tara can mean in Irish the place with the wide open view, which is really boring, but it does have a great view. But its root word is an Indo-European word meaning sanctuary or temple. But it also can, in the Dinshenkas, it's called Tea Mor, and Tea is an Egyptian princess, and who was related to Solomon. And she had acquired this fabulous object here and brought it from the Holy Land, the Ark of the Covenant, and brought it to Ireland, where she died and was buried with the Ark of the Covenant. So the British Israelites believed Irish mythology, that she was actually an Egyptian princess and brought the ark. So they started digging in the Hill of Tara really brutally. Those cuts I showed you earlier in the Wrath of the Synods was from their excavations. They obviously didn't find the Ark of the Covenant, it wasn't there. Indiana Jones found it. But then there's also the whole notion of Tara is wrapped up in St. Patrick. So Patrick, the story of St. Patrick, I know I'm going over time, so I'll speed. Patrick is an interesting character as well because he's the guy that converts all of Ireland, but he doesn't really. There's about 5 or 6 Patricks. So we know there's a guy called Palladius who comes to Ireland, to the Irish believing in Christ before Patrick gets to Ireland. So we've reasonable records, and there's been some really good scholarly work on. There's probably about 5 St. Patricks operating in Ireland at the same time, converting. But Patrick is the one, and he's a Welsh slave, a Roman slave that gets brought to Ireland after the Romans leave Britain, and the legions go, and it causes a power vacuum, and he's robbed as a slave, brought to Ireland, but then leaves Ireland and goes to Gaul, where he's trained as a bishop, and then returns to Ireland to convert the pagan Irish. And there's 2 biographers, so he's knocking around Ireland in the 5th century. And what happens is he's on a hill very close to Tara called Slane, and the king, the high king, but there's no high king. Remember that, I've just told you that there's no high king. But according to the legend, the high king was the first person to light a fire around the equinox, around the 21st of March. So St. Patrick's Day is the 17th of March. It's very close to the equinox. So the king is meant to light a fire on Tara, and then fires on all the hills of Ireland are then subsequently lit. But Patrick comes along on an adjoining hill at the Hill of Slane, and he lights a fire, and all the hills then subsequent, and that's the symbol of the spread of Christianity. And King Lear at the time goes, I'm going to kill that guy. He shouldn't have lit that fire. So Patrick is summoned to the king, but Patrick is so persuasive, the king becomes a Christian, and this is the beginning of Christianity. This is because there's 2 biographers of Patrick. One of them they're both bishops of Armagh in the 7th century, so that's 200, 300 years after Patrick was supposed to be around. So they wrote a propaganda about Patrick. One of them is a guy called Bishop Tyrconnell, and the other one is Murchu. When Murchu was writing, it was when the Southerly Neil or the Northerly Neil were encroaching. So Armagh was their royal centre in the 7th, 8th century. And the Northerly Neil were trying to lay a bit more claim to the Southerly Neil dynastic group at Tara. So Patrick was their symbol. So that's why Patrick is down at Tara converting people to Christianity. He was never there. Well, we don't really know, but the whole story of Irish conversion to Christianity is based on propaganda coming from an 8th century monk, trying to create a dynastic link with Tara from Armagh. Not many people know this, and that's what I'm trying to convey to you, is that, the statue gets, there's all contention. This statue here was the one that they wanted to replace the old statue with, but everybody protested because he's a bald, ugly guy. That doesn't look like St. Patrick. St. Patrick's got a big crozier and a shamrock and a bishop's hat. So there was revolt in the late 90s when the governments were going to replace the old statue, which was getting a bit shook. It was put up in the 1890s. And there was actually there was shotgun pellets. He was damaged by people shooting him. So this was the thing they were going to replace. There was a big objection. So in the end, this is the statue that's there now. And it was donated by the Sisters of Charity, a convent in nearby Navan in 2000. So everybody was calm about that. But what I'm trying to convey, I'm going to skip to the very last slide. There's millions of slides, as you can see. Because I talk too much. There it is. So what I'm trying to say is I'll just go back a couple. Just where was it? You can see like I'm going a bit insane. So what you're finding is, I'll go back to this one here. They were going to build a motorway in 2007. They did build a whopping great big dual carriageway. It's amazing. It saves 20 minutes of your travel time if you're traveling from Kells to Dublin now. So you get to Dublin 20 minutes quicker because of this big dual carriageway. Ireland underwent the Celtic Tiger, this massive economic boost from the late 90s, and then we had the big collapse in 2008 with the same in all around the world, thanks to American bankers in New York and greed. But when they were building, this was kind of, I'm really interested in this because this symbolises the Irish government giving up on their Celtic past. This was how people reacted. So this is like a protest to save the Tara Valley. The road doesn't actually impact Tara at all, but in people's minds it did. So, so there was this really big protest movement, and people were chaining themselves to diggers. They were putting, what kind of stuff would you put in somebody's petrol tank? Sugar into petrol tanks of the diggers and stuff. So it was a big contentious thing, and it was kind of a collapse of the. It felt like the government were giving up on a Celtic identity. You can see Tara cover up. Tara was old when Christ was born. Stop the culture vultures. Tara is not ours, it's our children's. It was this very, powerful thing. And now Tara is a place where other groups appropriate it. So you've got neo-pagans are starting to use it. You have a summer solstice festival. Tara has absolutely nothing got to do with the summer solstice, but a whole load of neo-pagans turn up there. So it's still being appropriated and still being used. And for us, and now I'll skip to the very end. Sorry about this. I was very. So for us as archaeologists and historians, is what I'm trying to convey is that you're seeing multiple narratives, multiple uses, multiple interpretations, a whole load of different interest groups, from New Age hippies, neo-pagans, ideologies that are kind of loaded with religion and politics. And so for us as historians and archaeologists, we tend to write books like these on Tara for historians and archaeologists to read. And I know you guys, a lot of you guys are involved in public archaeology. How do we, as archaeologists and historians, kind of approach the complexity, the multiculturalism, these diverse interpretations of place, whether it's a statue to a Civil War hero, all of these that's the kind of challenge that we have, I think. I try to get myself involved with community heritage projects to educate them, and that sounds it sounds, who are you to come along and tell us about our past? But I think that as archaeologists and historians, that we try to be as objective as possible. So to try and, how do we then explain the past in a balanced way that fits into these multiple narratives is the challenge that I'd like to finish with. Thank you. Sorry for going on and on and on. I actually deleted about 20 slides. I obviously didn't speak fast enough.
I want to open it up for questions, but I want you to know that Sam is here until Thursday, and there are opportunities to have lunch with him, go to dinner with him. There will be times when he's going to be hanging out in the lab in Weiser Patton. So I want to make sure that everyone, that I say that, and everyone that wants to take advantage of that does. You can email me, and I can send out the schedule too, and and let everybody know where he's going to be. And if you want to join us for lunch or dinner, we can figure that out. So, but let's open the floor to questions.
Please.
It's kind of a two-part question. One, are these mounds common knowledge around the area? And Two, what is the local response when you tell them that their story of the ransom, like, you know, is it true? You know, when does archaeology, when archaeology proves their legend false, how do they respond? How do you respond?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of knowledge about it. It's kind of, there's a problem, and again, there's about 200,000 people visit this place every year, but there's no interpretation, there's no conservation, there's no management plan, there's no guides, there's no information panels hardly, there's very little car parking, and it's crazy. And this is the place that Irish identity in many respects revolves around in a lot of ways. So it's a bit neglected by our government. So the locals are very keen to get, you know, we have all of these academics, a lot of us have been doing work on Tara. And I showed you in that previous 2 slides ago that, you know, there's some really amazing publications that have come out, mainly from a crowd called the Discovery Programme. So we have a really good handle on it, but it's imparting that is very difficult. Because you have these different groups that have interest in it. So you have the kind of Christian St. Patrick followers, and you have the neo-pagans, and you have the American tourists, or the German tourists, or the Irish tourists. So there's a whole load of different people utilizing the space with different desires and needs. So they're aware, not maybe of all the monuments that are there, because like I said, there's no interpretation. To show you all of those, like the invisible barrows and invisible sites. And there's hardly any interpretation there to explain any of them. All that are is, a lot of people went, I went to the Hill of Tara, there's a lot of lumps and bumps, and, you know, a nice view, and a good bookshop. And it's kind of, even when you go to the bookshop, hardly any of these are for sale. They're all kind of New Age, ley line energy, Celtic spirituality, fake news stuff. Because these are about 50 euros to buy each. You know what I mean? Because they're for an academic audience. And if somebody is interested in Tara and you pick up one of these, you're barely going to understand any of it, because it's, again, so we as archaeologists and historians, I think, have to consider this idea of engaging with people and with the different groups that might be interested in, and try and come up with a kind of a balanced narrative. So it's a real challenge. And like you were, because I know you're interested in preservation, so there's an issue about conservation and managing the site. You can see, where is it gone? You can see, well, not in that picture, there's probably a picture somewhere back there. But with pathways and erosion, up around here after a bad spell of rain, that's above your ankles in water, it floods. All the ditches flood. There's not a lot you can do about that. It's still being farmed, so there's cattle, which is good management because it's keeping the grass down. But people complain about standing in cow poo. There's always somebody. Does that answer your?
Yeah, and then also like when you tell them that they're legend that they've been hearing.
Oh yeah. Well, most people laugh. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I get accused of myth busting. But I think some of the myth busting stories are more entertaining than the real story. Yeah. You know, so the great one is, a lot of people, some of you might be aware that St. Patrick is apparently banished all the snakes from Ireland. Have you heard that story? Yeah. So St. Patrick comes along and there's no snakes in Ireland, which is good because it makes field work safer. So there's no snakes, but there's never been snakes. There's no fossil records of snakes, or never snakes. The ice bridge. So there's a reasonable, a rational explanation for there being no snakes, not because Patrick banished them. But the real story is, St. Patrick's up on top of a sacred mountain called Croagh Patrick, it's called. It's a Bronze Age, there's Bronze Age burial mounds on this quartz. It's a phenomenal place in County Mayo, a really dramatic landscape. And the story is that St. Patrick goes there and he spends 40 days and 40 nights on top of the mountain fasting, as saints kind of do on a regular basis. And while he's up there, he's obviously hallucinating. If you haven't eaten for 40 days and 40 nights and you're on top of a mountain on the west of Ireland, you're going to be like cold and wet and kind of a bit spaced out. So demonic birds, the devil sends demonic birds to attack him. And he's losing the plot, and all these birds are flying around him. And he throws his bell at the birds, but that doesn't work. The bell breaks. And if you actually go to the National Museum in Dublin, his bell, there's a broken bell. That's St. Patrick's bell. Anyway, that's another story. But angels arrive down and help him, and they banish the demonic birds. But a Scottish monk in the 10th century is translating that story, which was written by Tyrconnell in the 7th or 8th century, one of the biographers of Patrick. And he mistranslated demonic birds and wrote serpents. So it was a spelling mistake by a Scottish monk in the 10th that actually banished the snakes from Ireland, and not St. Patrick. He banished demonic birds. So I think that story is better than the banishing the snake story. Yeah. So if you kind of engage that kind of way, it works. I think, yeah. Mr. Ireland.
Found anywhere else in the world to make a connection?
Sorry?
The architecture with the reverse walls with the slope.
Yeah. So in Britain you get a lot of these. But they're kind of different because these internally ditched enclosures in Britain tend to be Neolithic in date. The Irish ones are Iron Age. So you get Stonehenge. So we call these hengiform enclosures. And classic British henges are Neolithic in date, late Neolithic, about 3000 to 2500 BC. They have a bank on the outside and a ditch on the inside. And they often have opposing entrances. And there's often timber structures within the middle of it, of these big henges. The Stonehenge is a little bit different. Everybody calls it a henge, but it's not like any other henge because it's got a ditch on the outside and a bank on the inside, which isn't normal. And then the word henge is a stupid word. It actually means hanging. It's an Anglo-Saxon word meaning hanging. So Stonehenge is hanging stones. But it's the only place where there's hanging stones. So there is a silly word. But we're stuck with them. So in Britain, they're late Neolithic. In Ireland, at the same time, we were making these things called embanked enclosures, which they weren't cutting ditches. They were scooping earth out to make a bank on the outside and this kind of shallow area on the inside. And then later, we start building these whopping great big internally ditched enclosures. And this is rock cut. Like it's going down at 2 meters. It's all silted up now, but they've actually dug bedrock out. Back about, the dates are about 170, 200 BC, that kind of period. So it's a serious undertaking. That's tons of rock that was moved. So it's all ceremonial and ritual. The idea of cutting into the earth is releasing perhaps otherworldly or underworlds chthonic forces. And this space then contains those otherworldly forces. So it's potentially a dangerous place. So there's ideas, I'm very interested in liminal thresholds or boundaries. So if you kind of think about medieval churches have a whole series of boundaries where the tabernacle is the core, that's the axis mundi, often below the spire of the church. But you've got to cross through a door, through a rood screen. The altar is often higher above the chancel. So you have all these series of religious boundaries. These things act like that as well, I think.
So one more, and then...
I'm available afterwards and for the next few days. So.
Who's Granny?
Pardon?
Who's Granny?
Grania. Yeah, Grania. Oh, you want to be, I'm a fan of Grania. All right, yeah, Grania. So there's this fantastic story called The Pursuit of Dermot and Grania. That's what you asked, Grania. Does everybody want to hear about Dermot and Grania very quickly? So it's a fantastic collection of stories. So there's a crowd called the Fianna, and these are kind of warriors. They're kind of, don't really have anybody controlling them. They're a bit wild, and they go around hunting a lot and having adventures and drinking and meeting goddesses and meeting otherworldly beings. There's all kinds of great adventures they have, and they're led by a guy called Fionn McCool. And Fionn McCool has when he was a young guy, did all of these heroic deeds. And one of the stories, he was with a guy who caught a salmon of knowledge. And this, that's a whole other story. But the guy who caught the salmon of knowledge was cooking it and asked Fionn to help him tend the fire. So Fionn was tending the fire, and some of the grease from the salmon burnt Fionn's finger, and he sucked it and got all the knowledge. So he could see into the future and predict things and do all of these cool things by sucking his thumb. But Fionn was this super duper heroic guy, and he was supposed to marry King Cormac MacArt's daughter Grania. So Fionn and the Fianna arrive in Tara to the banqueting hall. This thing, which isn't a banqueting hall, but and Cormac and Fionn don't exist because they're all mythical. But so Fionn and they arrive at the banqueting hall, and Grania, the day before the wedding, Grania's pouring wine for them. So they're all sitting around the great table with the king and Fionn, and a princess serves them, which is a real, this is an honour. Well, one of the Fianna is a guy called Dermot, and he's gorgeous. Like he's a really handsome guy, and he has a beauty spot on his head. That anytime a woman sees the beauty spot, they're, oh, Dermot! Like they're totally besotted with Dermot. So he used to have to wear a little hat to cover his beauty spot to stop women falling in love with him. But as Grania's pouring the wine, she knocks his hat off, sees his beauty spot, and falls madly in love with Dermot, and gets him to elope with her. And Dermot doesn't want to do this because he's going to piss his boss off. Because Fionn is supposed to be marrying Grania the next day, and here's one of Fionn's men going to run off with her. But because he's a warrior, he can't refuse the request of a member of the royal family. So he has to obey. It's taboo. It's called a geish or a geisha, a taboo. That taboos are a whole other story involved with her. But so they run away, and Fionn chases them for years. And they hide at portal tombs, these megalithic monuments. And so in the Ordnance Survey, these megalithic monuments are often called beds of Dermot and Grania, Labba Dermot agus Grania. And later in folklore, those beds are places where barren women would sleep in the hope to get fertile. But they're actually Neolithic monuments. But they eventually, a god appears, a guy called Angus, and makes peace between Fionn, Dermot and Grania. And Dermot and Grania move to Sligo, near to where I live. But then Dermot, Fionn, so everything's cool, everything's grand, it's all peace and love. But Dermot hears the Fianna hunting on a mountain in Sligo called Ben Bulben, and there's a magic boar that lives on the mountain. And Dermot decides he'd like to join the Fianna in the hunt, so he goes off, and the Fianna aren't catching the boar at all. Dermot arrives because he's a super dude as well. He stabs the boar in the back with a spear. So he jumps on the boar's back and sticks the spear through his head. But the boar flicks his head just as he's dying and fatally wounds Dermot. So Dermot's lying dying, and Fionn McCool's magic finger that he can see into the future, if you drink out of his hand, it'll cure you. as well. So Dermot's dying, and the Fianna say, "Oh, Fionn, will you let Dermot drink out of your magic finger or out of your hand?" But Fionn accidentally drops the water 3 times because he hasn't really forgiven him for running away with Grania. So Dermot dies, and he's buried in a cave at the back of Ben Bulben. And when Grania hears of her lover's death, she dies of sadness and is buried in the cave with him.
Oh, and that's a wonderful place to start.